All right, everybody, welcome back to the Radio FWD podcast. I'm very excited to finally talk about a singular film, like really dive deep into a single film on this show. And I'm really excited to bring an expert on the films of Dennis Hopper, Stephen Lee Naish. Welcome to the show, Stephen. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, Shawn. Thanks so much for having me, man. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so this is really exciting because like all the other episodes I've had so far, it's been great to talk about the guests, career paths and the sort of things that they do in the film industry. But really my passion and the inspirations for starting this show came from all the other podcasts that I listened to dissecting film. And this is like really exciting for me. So I'm super excited to get into the film that, this episode is inspired by. So we're getting into Easy Rider. But first, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your new book.
Yeah, thanks, man. So, my name's Stephen Lee Naish. I'm a film writer, film critic, film analyst. I've been writing for about 15 years about film. My latest book is called Music and Sound in the Films of Dennis Hopper. It's published by Routledge as part of their Filmmakers and Their Soundtrack series. Which also has some really great books in there. Recently, one published on David Lynch and his film sound style. And like Dennis Hopper has kind of been my focus for many, many years. And so it was a wonderful thing. This is actually my second book on Dennis Hopper.
Oh, wow.
And so I was very appreciative to dive back into his work and sort of mix two things that are kind of I'm passionate about, which is music and film. And this was a way to kind of combine both things. So, that's the current book that's doing the rounds at the moment.
It works perfectly because this was exactly my crossover into film, which was music. I started off with music reviews, on Rate Your Music and on the, music forum boards and listening to new album releases. I don't think I've listened to a 2025 release because all of my time is now dedicated to watching film. But the film soundtracks was the crossover for me. And one of the most interesting parts of the introduction from your book relates to what most people think about the style of certain directors is the visual style, the editing style, the colors, the framing, the blocking of certain characters. Like you think of a Wes Anderson movie, you don't even need to know that he directed something. If you watch a random short of his, if somebody hadn't seen a movie of his, you could still pick out that this is his style, right? Now, but you don't think about if you listened to a film without seeing it, could you pick apart the style of the director from the sound of the film? And this is a really interesting concept. And so what got you interested in the sound and music of Dennis Hopper's films?
Well, I think like you, Shawn, actually, I was also just a huge fan of compilation soundtracks, like, from film soundtracks and compilation CDs and albums. So I kind of grew up on that. So it was a really, that was a lot of an introduction to music for me, was just the fact that you could listen to one record and it would be different songs by different artists. So I really kind of agree how I also kind of really, got into film as well, just through.
Do you remember the soundtracks? Do you remember the first soundtracks that got you into it?
Do I want to admit it though? Because embarrassing. But a few years ago, I wrote a book about Dirty Dancing. Right, it was a deconstruction of Dirty Dancing, and that film has had a complicated relationship with that film actually, because when I was a kid, when it more or less came out, I was still quite young, but I have an older sister, so she would watch the film, and I loved it as a kid. I thought it was great. The soundtrack was amazing. It's all these great 60s songs. And then, you get to be a teenager and you kind of distance yourself from a film like that, right? Because you're a young male and that's not socially acceptable. But I always maintain that the soundtrack to that film is just a wonderful, wonderful soundtrack. So that was kind of the very first one that kind of comes to mind. But yeah, a film soundtrack like to the film Go from '99, Human Traffic.
Oh, hell yeah.
Yeah,
Go and I absolutely love Human Traffic. I think that's amazing deconstruction of UK club culture and rave music. It's really incredible.
It really is. And
underrated.
not a bunch of music that I would just be listening to, but
No.
it was actually like just to hear that soundtrack on its own, but also in context of the film as well. It was very important. It was really good. But yeah, Easy Rider obviously is obviously a big soundtrack for me, and you know, it's a soundtrack that contains a lot of songs from the 1960s, way before I was born. Like I came into the world 12 years later after
Mm,
this film was released. I was born in '81, so all of this music had disappeared basically by the time I was a kid. It was it was the New Romantics, it was punk, it was
sure.
yeah, like not stuff that I grew up with at all. But for some reason, maybe in my late teens, early 20s, this music came back around actually. Bands like that I was into, like Oasis, back in the UK, would reference bands like the Beatles and stuff like that, and
Sure.
you'd go back and listen to the Kinks and the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and stuff like that, and they all started connecting with each other, and eventually lead into stuff like Bob Dylan and Jimi Hendrix and things like that. It was all these bands were all very, very influential on the stuff that was happening back then. So yeah, so I don't know, like I maybe wouldn't listen to a Bob Dylan record, but I would listen to an Easy Rider soundtrack, and I would get my hit of Bob Dylan. I would get my hit of Steppenwolf,
Right.
of Jimi Hendrix, and some other weird sort of psychedelic moments that happen in there as well, the Birds and stuff like that. And it was kind of a little history lesson in its own little capsule. I like the
Yeah.
capsule history lesson of that era. But I mean, the soundtrack came a bit later, really. For me, it was the film first, so that drew me in. But I've always maintained that watching Easy Rider is a bit like putting on an album.
Yeah. That's a really good way of putting it.
It's not really, obviously you can sit and immerse yourself in the movie, but ultimately you can just let it wash over you. You can do other things while this movie's on, and it's still an entertaining experience because you're getting this audio complement as well. So, yeah, I've always kind of maintained that. So.
One of the things you mentioned in the book is the groundbreaking nature of the soundtrack itself, in implementing contemporary music in a sort of playlist type way. This is the sort of music that Dennis Hopper was probably hearing amongst the counterculture, amongst the youth too. And Dennis Hopper was what, 31 years old when he directed this, or
Yeah.
33 years old. It's not like he wasn't a youngin, he wasn't a kid in this time, but he still tapped into the youth culture and the youth zeitgeist and put together this film soundtrack. Why is it that this was so groundbreaking? What did the film soundtracks of the 40s and 50s sound, or even the early 60s sound like, compared to this? Why was this and the Graduate, why were they so groundbreaking?
Yeah, so I mean, before Easy Rider, really the sort of practice of most film makers was to have a score, right, or have a soundtrack, created by one artist. And you can look at like The Graduate, which is obviously a Simon and Garfunkel record. So that was all recorded by Simon and Garfunkel. But this Easy Rider kind of came along, and it layered tracks that were kind of playing on the radio at that point that people owned in their record collections, and it placed them right over the top of the film. Now, initially, Hopper and Peter Fonda, who co-stars with Hopper in Easy Rider, the initial thing was to get Crosby, Stills, and Nash to record a soundtrack, an original soundtrack. So really, it would have been very similar to of the films that kind of came out. But there was disagreements between Hopper and that band, and it didn't quite happen. And I think what maybe Dennis Hopper and Peter Fonda kind of did was, was kind of layer tracks that they were listening to over the top of their film, so that maybe later down the line, a kind of music coordinator could come in and create a soundtrack similar to the songs that were playing. But actually, in the end, people just said, look, this is working perfectly, right? Like, this is how this film should be, and so that's kind of where it kind of came from, really. And maybe it was a bit of an accident, maybe it was kind of on purpose, but ultimately you get this soundtrack of songs that were just very contemporary for the time, a few years previous that they'd been released. And yeah, and then so I don't know, like we'll don't want to get too ahead of ourselves, but you kind of asked about this idea of Dennis Hopper's uh, style, and his, my book argues that his style really was to tap into youth culture through music, and not through the visuals so much.
Yeah, the jumps in genre from film to film, from Easy Rider to Out of the Blue to Colors, is incorporating a new genre almost every single time, incorporating some aspect of youth culture every time. He seems very very tapped into what's happening. It creates a really cool atmosphere, and it I think cool is like the perfect adjective for Easy Rider,
Yeah.
and I mean the characters are so cool in this film, and we'll get into that in a second. I wanted to ask a follow up quickly about creating this soundtrack. What was like the order of operations? Did they already have the songs in mind and then they came up with the scenes, or was the film already done and then did they have songs in mind when they were filming scenes? Like how did that work?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, a lot of these songs come from Peter Fonda's record collection, and he was basically just, you got to sort of take it in the context of the 1960s. They were all friends, right? Like they all
Yeah,
hung out together. Dylan and Hopper and Fonda were all friends with each other. They all knew each other. They hung around in the same circle. So it was probably very loose in terms, initially very loose. Hey, can I use this song on this film that I'm making? And these musicians would be like, yeah, that sounds great, man. Yeah, you go ahead and do that. But then, of course, you run up against the bureaucracy, right? The record
sure.
labels come
Of
in.
course.
So, when it came to the actual film, you get, you get like a song by the band, which is, the song is called The Wait. And when the soundtrack comes out, they couldn't obtain the rights for it. So they had to get another band to re record the song for the soundtrack album. And that happens a little bit later on as well with Dylan. So again, they couldn't get Dylan the rights to Dylan. The song "It's All Right, Ma, I'm Only Dying" and the Ballad of Easy Rider. They actually couldn't get rights to Dylan to actually have that song so they got Roger McGuinn from the Byrds to
The
re-record.
Birds, that's right.
Yeah, so I think it was a cool concept, but then they kind of ran up against the studio, the record company heads, and
Sure.
had to go the legal routes, and that kind of put a stop
Yeah.
in it. But I mean, they still obviously developed a very cool soundtrack, so not really a problem that Roger McGuinn is covering Dylan and
Yeah.
Smith covering band. It doesn't really matter too much.
No,
So
it's still an amazing mishmash of all these people who,
yeah.
like you said, they all knew each other.
And interestingly, so I mean, because I knew I was doing this, I kind of listened. I put the soundtrack album on
Nice.
from my Amazon music, and it was just skipping through all the tracks. I was like, well, hold on a second, what's going on? And I looked, and of course, these tracks are not these tracks are not licensed to this
That's right.
soundtrack. So I had to like go into the artist to listen to the actual
That's
song.
funny.
I couldn't just listen from the so
I love that you mentioned having to face the establishment, because the establishment is sort of embedded in Jack Nicholson's character, and this is a great moment for us to wrap back and actually summarize the film. So it was my first time watching Easy Rider. I'm obviously a huge fan of Dennis Hopper himself, but this was right up my alley. I love sort of these meandering films without a plot, where a character just kind of exists in the vibe of their environment and is subject to the whims of whatever forces beyond the character themselves. And that's how the film feels. It stars, again, like you said, Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper are these sort of bohemian motorcycle like renegade drifters who do a cross country trip from West Coast to they want to go to New Orleans, they want to go to Mardi Gras, but not before they score big on a big drug deal. And drugs are a huge theme that are kind of intertwined throughout the film as well. You've got the drug counterculture, you've got the and so okay, so they score big on a big drug deal, and they're on these tricked out motorcycles that are covered in American flags, and they're driving through the American natural landscape, and they encounter a bunch of these characters, right? Like they they end up meeting a homesteader and reminiscing, or sort of like realizing that this is sort of what they wanted. Like this person is free in their own way. Every once in a while they meet characters, and then the film is intercut with camping scenes, like in the middle of the woods, where they get to reflect on what they just saw. And during these scenes, these camping scenes, the soundtrack just cuts out, and you just get like nature sounds. You get crackling fires. You get birds and bugs chirping, and frogs. They have a great conversation about the frogs in the film. Um, yeah, do you wanna continue describing the film?
Yeah, sure. Well, I've always thought, you're all right. It is kind of a plotless movie in a sense, but they are moving from A to B. The tagline of the film originally was "A man went looking for America and couldn't find it anywhere," and I think that does summarize it. But I also don't think that they're looking for America. I think they're trying to. These characters are escaping America. They
Mm.
are, Billy, who is played by Dennis Hopper, and Wyatt, who is played by Peter Fonda. They're at the end of the '60s, and I speculate that they were probably a part of the '60s, radical movements that occurred. They were probably at Woodstock. They were, the Monterey Pop Festival. They were probably, part of all these love-ins that occurred, and they've decided that basically the '60s is over, and they're going to drop out of society, which is what they do. So they go to they step over the border into Mexico. They purchase cocaine. They come back to the United States, and they score this big deal with this rich guy, and
Played by Phil
they
Spector, right?
they're played by Phil Spector, exactly. Yeah, yeah, and I mean, I don't know how much they actually got for this deal, but they buy these incredible bikes, and then they're going to go to retire in Florida. Basically, they travel across the southern states to Florida, or they don't quite get there, obviously, and they swing by Mardi Gras. So yeah, I don't know how much money they actually had, but they hide it in the tanks of their motorcycles, and yeah, they just continue across the landscape. And yeah, you're right. They meet people. They meet a bunch of hippies in a commune, and each sort of meeting is a potential avenue for them to settle, into a life. The hippie commune is a community, obviously, and that could be a place where they could stay. And then they meet George Hansen, who is played by Jack Nicholson, who's this kind of drunkard lawyer who accompanies them to New Orleans as well. And yeah, when
Again,
they get to New Orleans,
these counterculture, the movements that make up the image of the hippie aren't in the film. Like you said, you imagine that they might have been at Woodstock, or they might have been part of these love-ins, but they're not featured in this film. And so when they meet George, it is sort of they're meeting the end of the '60s, right? This is now a drunkard lawyer, Southern lawyer, but he apparently has done work for the ACLU, and so he is like maybe also sympathetic to the cause, but hasn't quite fully dove in, and speaks differently from Wyatt, and speaks differently from Billy. Like, he is such a mirror image, despite probably having sympathies, right?
yeah, no, he's completely removed from what's occurred basically on the the sort of West Coast or the East Coast or whatever. Like he's Middle America, completely oblivious to what's occurred, completely oblivious to the language being used. He's confused by the word "dude." Uh,
That's right.
he's never come across grass.
Yeah.
Well, he's kind of he's obviously heard of it, but he's shocked when he's presented with it. Um, and yeah, he's a fun character. He arrives. Jack Nicholson's character arrives just as the film is entering this kind of very strange plateau where you're kind of bored of Billy and Wyatt. You kind of want a bit of an injection, and he arrives to add a bit of humor to the film and a little bit of drama as well. because again, there's that push and pull. I always feel like, the Peter Fonda's character Wyatt is just one good deal away from stepping away from Billy. I really feel like Billy is dragging Wyatt down, and at any moment they could go their separate ways, and that would be heartbreaking for Billy. But yeah, so again, it kind of adds a little tension in a film that doesn't really have an awful lot of tension until you get to the very end, really. So yeah.
Yeah, so they continue on from they welcome George onto the troop, and George hops on the back of I guess it must have been Wyatt's bike, and they continue traveling down. They stop for food at a diner where they encounter, salt of the earth. Definitely have never encountered hippies, or are very anti-hippie, anti-counterculture, establishment, very conservative people. They also like flaunt. So George is this flaunting misogynist at the same time, we realize, because there are these like schoolgirls that are like fawning over the men, and he is like making these comments about it, but also like playing very risky, because there's the sheriff in town, there's like other men in the diner who are watching over them, and so they leave the diner without getting any food, and we come to, I think, like the pretty much the tonal shift of the film. This is where you get this is where not only the genre of the songs change from the typical classic rock, you know, uh, driving down the highway anthems, to abstract psychedelic jazz blues infused psych rock that sort of devolves because the gang is assaulted overnight by the very men at the diner, and George loses his life, and they're on their way to some sort of brothel, right?
First of all, it's really interesting to point out that the patrons of the diner there were real patrons of the diner. They weren't actors or anything like that. I mean, they probably got paid to do that role, but yeah, like Dennis Hopper just went in and said, "Okay, guys, we are coming in. We're going to do some filming here, and you're going to say really mean things about us, and these girls over here, you're going to try and flirt with us, and we're just going to play it very loose." So it was kind of improvised in some respect, and so that's a really interesting moment. But yeah, that diner scene kind of brings a bit more tension to the film, I think. And you're right, you get this. So up until this point, we've had these very kind of like breezy, wide open shots of Billy Wyatt traveling across this very open landscape, and then suddenly we start entering into a more kind of urban environment as we enter into like Texas, basically. They're assaulted, George is killed, and Wyatt and Billy decide that they'll just continue on to where they were going, which was this brothel. And from this point on, you're right, yeah. So the music has changed because we're entering into a more kind of we've left a kind of breezy rock behind, and also the lyrical content as well changes too. We're initially kind of confronted with Jimi Hendrix's really kind of discordant playing on the song "If 6 Was 9," and the lyrical content of that song is very almost kind of nihilistic in a way. It's there's lyrics in there that sort of say, if the mountains fell into the sea, I don't care. If the hippies cut off all their hair and stuff like that, it really is kind of like a tonal shift in the end of the 60s. It's this destroy it all, doesn't matter anymore. I've given up. So you kind of get that tonal shift as well. But then the two characters continue on to Mardi Gras with two of the women from the brothel, exactly, yeah. And again, like, we've had these open vistas, we've had these beautiful shots, and then suddenly we're kind of like we've entered into this kind of really dirty sense of the film as well. Like the film stock is grimy. They used a different film stock. They shot it like a year before as well, because they didn't shoot at the time. They actually went and shot like well, maybe not a year, but a few months before anyway, because they weren't quite in time for it or something like that. So that's very different. Um, and then you get this overlapping sound of what's kind of occurring at the Mardi Gras festival. So you get these these like jazz and blues musicians, like street musicians, playing. Even when the Saints come marching in, overlapping with all these bells and whistles from the people at the festival and stuff, and it's very it's quite overwhelming. The
Yeah,
sound is you get these churning machines that are going on in the background. I'm not going to
right.
pretend to know what they are, but I think
It's
that
a
they're
oil
oil
drilling,
extractors, yeah, and that kind of comes in. It provides this kind of throbbing, uh, you know, like smashing kind of sound, and then
industrial soundtrack, pretty much. Like,
and then we enter into like what a trip scene, basically. That it's kind of an infamous trip scene where they take acid in this graveyard, the four characters, and just trip out. It's this incredible montage of images and sound, and it's completely it sticks out like a sore thumb amongst the
yeah.
film because
Not
you've
to
been
mention what you said before about the actual film grain, just like the quality of the shots kind of devolve, and there's already really interesting editing choices, like visual editing choices, where there's like these snap cuts that happen 3 or 4 times, and then the scene transitions, and then the editing in this trip scene kind of devolves, and it's all meant to represent a bad trip, I think, visually. But uh, you also mentioned again, like the texture visually gets corrupted, but also sonically, right? You have this
yeah
industrial thumping. You have I want to mention briefly the Saints Come Marching In song that they included, improvisational. Is it also diegetic? Is it part of the? Is it something they actually recorded when they were there?
yeah yeah it
So,
was yeah it
so
was all
not a
recorded on the
studio
film, yeah.
recording, not a studio
Mm,
recording, right? It
not a
adds
studio,
this,
no, no.
it adds this like lo-fi, uh, you know, just again like corrupted sort of
Hmm.
texture to it that matches so perfectly with the editing in this graveyard.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. But yeah, it's so disorientating. But Dennis Hopper again, like when Easy Rider, I don't know if we've already mentioned this, was an incredibly popular movie. Like it was made for like $300,000, which was it was independent, but
Wow.
it made like I don't know 80 million or something like that at the box office. It was a very big movie, and Dennis Hopper and Peter Fonda were kind of given carte blanche for their next films. They could do what they want, and so Dennis Hopper went and made this film called The Last Movie, which if you haven't seen, I just so recommend it. But basically, it takes that 10-minute trip scene, sound and visual, and just stretches it out across an entire 2-hour movie. And it's an incredible art film. The Last Movie is an incredible art film as a mainstream film that they wanted to the studio wanted from him, because he was the voice of a generation. It doesn't work on that level, but it works on the last. It works as a very interesting art film and an artifact of that kind of era.
Well,
But
rejecting what the studios wanted is a sort of amazing representation of
yeah,
the
yeah, but using
counterculture.
but using studio money to do it, which is
Yeah, that's brilliant.
so it's very subversive. I mean,
Yeah.
it's so cool. But yeah, in my book, I go into the Last Movie as well, and I talk about the sound because basically all of the music is recorded on set. So you've got like Chris Christopherson on the set of the Last Movie playing guitar and singing. And it's recorded right there, and that's what appears on the soundtrack. And then again, you've got this blending of sound that kind of occurs um, within the film as well. We're not talking about that movie today, but yeah, like that is just such a great thing. So yeah, Dennis Hopper's kind of used that 10-minute sequence and stretched it out for 2 hours, and it creates an interesting film. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
But,
it's
to use
I absolutely loved it. I'm sure you're biased too, but it's after after writing about it. But this is a really incredible movie that it's humorous. Like there's one scene that I forgot to mention that totally stuck out with me. But they are they meet this homesteader for the first time, and they're working on their bikes, just as in the foreground the homesteader is like putting on a new horseshoe on his horse's foot, and it just like
yeah,
works so perfectly. But there's like little details like this, you could tell they just had such a great time with this film, even though there might be some famous interpersonal dramas that unfolded. And
Yeah.
obviously, you've got the freaking sun beating down your neck and you're filming outside for probably months at a time. It wasn't the most comfortable environment to film,
No,
but
no. And Dennis Hopper was a madman as well. Like,
yeah, yeah.
we haven't really touched on that,
No,
but
please do.
Dennis Hopper was a difficult person to work with at this point as well, and had, first of all, just had a very artistic vision that he wanted, and it was his way or no way, basically. So he
Yeah,
was very,
apparently there was a 4-hour cut of the film.
yeah, yeah. To be honest with you, if there is, I would love to see it. Like, I would sit through 4 hours of this movie. I
For
really
sure.
would. But maybe once, and that's never again. But um, yeah, so he was a very difficult person to deal with at this point. There was substance abuse that was also taking place. He had lived through the '60s. Let's put it that way. So he was
Yeah.
drinking, he was taking drugs. And that would continue on throughout the '70s as well. He was, he didn't really get off drugs until the mid '80s. So, he obviously had a great vision, and I personally believe that he was a genius, but he was a very troubled person in that space. So this was, like Peter Fonda, and did make an appearance in the last movie as a character, but very small role, and that was basically it for him and Peter Fonda. They never really made a film. They never made a film together again, and their friendship really did kind of break down after this as well. They didn't really ever mend that problem,
Yeah, well,
So that's unfortunate, because they could have made some great movies together. They were a great partnership, but obviously, I think it would have destroyed both of them pretty quickly.
uh-huh.
So, yeah,
It's
yeah.
like two unstoppable forces meeting.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, Peter Fonda went on and directed a movie as well, called The Hired Hand, the same year as the last movie. They were given $1 million each to go make films, and interesting that they both made westerns as well. They're both kind of,
Yeah.
and I think Easy Rider is a kind of a western as well.
Yeah.
You mentioned the guy with the horse there, and the bicycles are just, the motorcycles are just replacing the horses in this case, but it's
100%.
still that Highland drifter kind of movie, moving from A to B through the landscape. So, yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about what's different about the music from the beginning of the film to the end? What's the difference between the genres of Steppenwolf and Jimi Hendrix, which sort of bridges the gap, I think Jimi Hendrix does, to the really like the Trip soundtrack and the even more abstracted sounds near the end of the film?
Yeah, so I kind of touched on it previously. It's like you start the movie with, the Pusher, which is a song about from Steppenwolf, which is this kind of very slow rock song, which basically is about the difference between a drug dealer and a drug pusher. Now, I'm not sure I know the difference between the two of them, but I'm from a different generation. But anyway, but then you kick into Born to Be Wild by Steppenwolf, which really is the song that is most kind of associated with Easy Rider. It's just this very hopeful song. There's this sense that in the beginning of the film, even though the characters themselves are in the process of dropping out of American society, you still get this sense of it's the we, it's the collective. We are going to make it happen. Take the world in a love embrace, even though the characters themselves are not taking the world in a love embrace. Actually, they're distancing themselves from the world. So it's quite interesting. And then you get songs like The Wait and I Wasn't Born to Follow by the Byrds, and lyrically there could be some disassociation, but musically they kind of they follow a very kind of vibrant and positive kind of vibe. You get a sense of the positivity that is this kind of taking these two characters forward. And then and then you get the last song of that kind of period of the film is this breezy little folk anthem called "Don't Bogart That Joint," which is
the reefer anthem.
yeah, it is a reefer anthem by a band called the Fraternity of Men, and that's that's abruptly cut into. Actually, it's a very abrupt cut to "If Six Was Nine" by Jimi Hendrix.
Oh yeah.
And so yeah, and I said earlier, you know, this just that the language of that, or the lyrics of that song are kind of very nihilistic. They're kind of apocalyptic almost, you know. And again, you've had this collective we, and then suddenly you move to the individualistic I. You know, I don't care if the mountains fall into the sea. I don't care if you know, the hippies cut off their hair or whatever. It becomes very much more about the individual. And yeah, then you know, you move through the trip scene and this, you know, very discordant collection of music. And then the film comes to its conclusion with two Bob Dylan compositions. So you get this song called "It's All Right, Ma, I'm Only Dying" by Bob Dylan, which again is full of kind of apocalyptic imagery. It's not a hopeful song. The title kind of gives that away. And then you get to the end where Billy and Wyatt, I don't know, spoiler alert, are killed basically on the side of a road. They stick the finger up at the wrong guy, and both get shot. And then yeah, the Ballad of Easy Rider kind of takes over, which is a very simple composition written by Bob Dylan but performed by Roger McGuinn from the Byrds.
And it also snaps us out of this psychedelic soundtrack. It brings us kind of right back to the beginning.
It does, yeah. It's a very gentle ballad, and you know, it contains the lyric, which is kind of very associated with that final moment of all they wanted was to be free, and that's the way it's turned out to be.
Yeah,
freedom is basically death for Billy and Wyatt.
Sure.
You know, so yeah, the final shot is it's actually again quite a jarring shot within the film, because we've always maintained, you know, the level of where Billy and Wyatt are. You know, even when we're traveling across the great expanse of the American West, it's we're always with them, and then suddenly at the end of the film we go above them. The camera is within a helicopter, and it rises above the burning motorcycles on the road, and you get the road. And I think it's in there's a documentary called "Shaking the Cage," which is about Easy Rider, and you know, it's kind of accidental, but you know, you get the road that man build, and you get the road that God build, which is the river, and then you get this combination of river flows to the sea. It all comes together. It's like, wow, and it was all accidental, of course. You know,
well,
you know, when Dennis. Go on.
There's no, I was just saying that there's
serendipity, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it, because there's several dialectics that we're working with, right? There's the individual freedom and collective freedom, which is a push and pull dichotomy that we see throughout the film. There's the natural landscapes and the unnatural landscapes. By the way, all of the natural landscapes have the beast motorcycles, you know, like chugging along, and they're freaking loud, and they're like, you know, they're all I guess choppers is, I don't know if that's the correct terminology, but you know, they're the ones where you lean back like this, and it feels very dominating, you know, like their stances are dominating, and their attitude is obviously very dominating. And so it feels like man is conquering nature in those scenes, even though you have these beautiful, vast landscapes. You get their horses, right? You have their horses, but they're man-made, they're metal, they're screaming machines, and they have what's cool is that they have a pretty intimate relationship with these bikes, because they can work on them. They know the inner mechanisms of these bikes pretty well. You see a shot where they're, you know, working on maintaining the bikes when they meet the homesteader, of course. But there's also when they have to hide the money, they hide it inside of the motorcycle, right? They hide it in like one of the, I don't know if it's a fuel tanks, right? Like one of the pipes in the fuel tank or whatever. So they know this machine very intimately. It kind of becomes an extension of these characters and part of the, I don't know, and maybe this is too far, but sort of like the manifest destiny embodied in these characters, that they're kind of they're dominating the nature. They kind of supersede the nature, and I don't know.
Yeah, the CO2 emitted from this film is still in the atmosphere today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That ending is just so jarring, and I think anyone who paid attention to the music in the film, which I encourage you to do if you go and listen, if you go and watch the film and then go out and find the soundtrack, is you'll notice this slow progression, this slow death that you mentioned.
Yeah, and so actually, so to bring it back to like your original question there, and
Slow death.
you know, in my book, I sort of use the soundtrack as a sort of way to describe the sort of I don't know, the cultural arc of the 1960s. Now, look, I'm British. I was born way after, but you know, I feel that the 60s were a very radical moment in not just American history, but Westernized history, but also, you know, around the world. There was a real sense of youth mobility and a real opportunity that the world could be changed. We could move out of, you know, capitalism into something much more egalitarian. And what happened was that those notions became kind of rolled into the mainstream, or they were adapted and watered down. And you know, a lot of the people that were around in the 1960s that believed in those
Ideals.
believed in that ideology, sold out much later on down the line in the 1970s and 1980s. And which is why, you know, you get, I mean, you can almost look at this from the perspective of Dennis Hopper himself, right? So 1960s bohemian radical basically makes this film, which is, you know, is a sort of a dissection of the 1960s. And then, you know, Dennis Hopper himself becomes a Republican in the 1980s, right? Votes Reagan, votes Bush. I don't know if he was ever a social conservative, but he definitely sort of has, you know, in interviews come out as a fiscal conservative. So, you know, but then, you know, towards the end of his life, you know, he became an Obama voter, so maybe redeemed slightly. But, you know,
I'm not sure about that either.
I mean, he basically went from, you know, he returned to his Democrat roots, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
So like you can sort of follow the trace almost, but again, you can follow it in also Dennis Hopper's movies as well. You know, they all react to one another in some respects, you know.
Yes.
But they all, in some respects, all react to Easy Rider as well. You know, they kind of, there's definitely a cultural conversation going on within his films, but his films are also conversationally, you know, interacting with each other as well, which is through the narratives, but also through the soundtracks as well. You know, they I mean, we may touch up on this, I don't know, but you know, Easy Rider is this, you know, this hippie utopia, right? And that never materialized. And so, you know, his next film after the last movie comes 10 years later, and it's a punk rock soundtrack. And the punks were anti-hippie, basically, you know, and that's not just in style, but also, you know, in attitude as well. They weren't peace and love. It was much more
they were
confrontational with each other, right?
Yeah.
And then, you move into a film like Colors, which has like a hip-hop soundtrack, but that is actually a soundtrack of the counterculture of that period of time.
Absolutely.
And so, it's and again, it's a conversation from Colors to Easy Rider, basically saying that because Colors deals with gang culture, predominantly black, and you know these characters are saying this generation previous to us didn't do enough. Circumstances did not change.
Yeah, our material conditions are the same.
Material conditions exactly.
Didn't change.
Whereas you know the white hippies, the white boomers, they got rich. They
for sure.
Yeah,
bought up property.
Getting angry about this.
This is awesome. I mentioned this to you already, but I'm very fascinated by the grand narrative of Dennis Hopper's soundtracks because, like you said, they are in conversation with one another. What's missing from Easy Rider is actually emblematic of what you just said about the hippies, which is that they essentially did it. They were largely white, largely middle class, and excluded poor Black Americans from the zeitgeist.
Mm-hmm.
There's essentially one Black character in Easy Rider, and it's someone that Dennis Hopper has an argument with in on the streets of Mardi Gras. He like you see a random shot. It seems like just a shot of him walking down the street, and he's having like a confrontational argument with a musician or with somebody just who's hanging out and enjoying Mardi Gras.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously you have Jimi Hendrix sound, but he was sort of like accepted into the hippie mainstream. I mean, he like headlined Woodstock so many times, and he was sort of just generally accepted into the hippie mainstream. But what can you say about the lack of Black artists and musicians in Easy Rider, and how Dennis Hopper maybe reacted to that with Colors, or just in general, how did the culture accept Black musicians post hippie? Because, I mean, it's undeniable that Black music and Black culture shapes the mainstream now. It's undeniable. It is the mainstream.
Mm. Yeah. Well, I think what's really interesting about the Easy Rider soundtrack is that it's all rock and blues and folk, which is a mutation of Black music from the 1920s and 30s, right? And it's like, so really all of that music comes from Black musicians, really. But yeah, it's
uncredited.
Really,
pretty much
uncredited. Yeah, absolutely uncredited. But it's not just Black people, it's also women as well. There's barely a female voice on this soundtrack, which is not representative of the time. You had Grace Slick from Jefferson Airplane. You had Janis Joplin. That was just in rock. You had Tina Turner,
Nina Simone.
Yeah, so many female voices of that period, but they're not featured at all. No. But it's just representative of the film itself. It's a white person's movie, really. It is, you said it. There's one character really that gets any screen time, and it's this reveler at the Mardi Gras. And he doesn't talk. I mean, he's just staring Dennis Hopper down. That's all that's happening in that scene.
Yeah.
There's obviously the street musicians. They're Black and they're playing music on the street, but they're not included on the soundtrack as a, they don't get that production quality that the rest of the artists do. So yeah, I think it's just, and again, like the representation of women as well in Easy Rider. It's, I've seen this movie so many times, and every time I watch it, I realize that somebody is excluded from this film in some respects, whether it's on the soundtrack, whether it's in the visual. So really, yeah, but it's not representative of what was going on culturally in the 1960s. There was an embrace of race and gender, but it didn't pan out, right? Like it didn't resolve itself into the 1970s and the 1980s. So look, I mean, I speculate in the book that maybe Dennis Hopper thought there was more to be done, so we can't include these voices or something like that, And it's so, right. But I don't even think that. I don't think it was there was any intention behind it. They're white guys. They were listening to white guys, Sure. Dennis Hopper, yeah, but you're right. Later down the line, Dennis Hopper definitely rectified that with the Colors soundtrack. I mean, the Colors soundtrack is predominantly a Black artists. It's rap and hip hop, soul artists. The person that the musician that created the score of Colors, which has not been released, was Herbie Hancock.
Wow.
So it's musically that film is very Black orientated, but it's the perspective of that movie is actually two white cops. That's
Yeah.
the perspective of that film. I don't know. Do you want to talk a little bit about colors, or?
Yeah, you can keep going. I'd love to
Yeah,
hear
because
about it.
I'm excited. In my book, it was the hardest chapter to write because
Really?
I'm a working class to middle class white guy from the middle of England, right? Hip hop didn't enter my listening choices for many years, probably until this soundtrack. So it was a difficult one to write, but one of the ones that I just enjoyed researching so much. And yeah, so when you listen to the soundtrack, like separate from the film, so just the album itself, you would come away from that thinking that this film is predominantly about black people and the lives of the gang members. But then when you watch the film, you realize that it's from the perspective of these two white cops patrolling the black areas of LA, basically. And apart from the actual song "Colors" by Ice-T, every other song that appears on that soundtrack album is lowered in the mix. It comes from boom boxes playing in the background. It comes from car stereos. It creates this kind of like urban environment where these sounds are kind of heard, but they're not heard by the people viewing the film. They're heard by the characters, really. And I just think that that's I don't know. It feels like a choice for sure. But this is probably why the soundtrack is remembered more fondly than the actual film itself. I mean, I like Colors, but I prefer its soundtrack.
Oh, wow.
It's not one like Easy Rider where you can kind of mix and match the pair of them. This is kind of like it's one or the other, really, with Colors. And then I talk about the next film I talk about in the book is a film called The Hot Spot, which came out in 1990 and directed by Dennis Hopper, and that film contains this kind of really cool hybrid blues and jazz soundtrack from John Lee Hooker and Miles Davis. It's the first time those guys worked together, and it's in terms of their work, it's probably not an exceptional piece of music in terms of the stuff that they'd done in the past, but it's just a simmering, cool soundtrack basically to a film that is that kind of is a noir basically, so it kind of simmers under the film itself. So that's kind of a very brief oversight, I guess, of Dennis Hopper's kind of soundtrack.
Again, like this, the conversation that takes place between the soundtracks is very interesting and fascinating to me because the genres are related, like the contemporary genres, the ones that enter and leave the mainstream are all related. You mentioned how rock obviously came from black musicians and blues music and jazz, and then also hip hop in the same way comes from the same music and often takes from rock music too. And then you wrap that up wonderfully with the Hot Spot, like you said, and it's back to jazz music, back to basics.
Yeah, one thing I will say about the Hot Spot, which I talk about in my book a little bit, is again, it's a white movie. It's white characters, soundtracked by black musicians in this case.
Right.
Again, there's one black character in the Hot Spot who gets a little bit of speaking role, but he's a blind character. So it's like, and again, it's male musicians creating themes for white female characters. It's interesting when you think about like Dennis Hopper's work. I'm so into it, but I realize there's a lot of problems with it too, and
Yeah, sure.
I don't hide that. Like I'm not a Dennis Hopper propagandist or anything. I'm very aware that there's issues with his work.
Of course, but that's what makes it fascinating to write
which
about.
I go into and I do talk about, and
yeah,
not just talk about, but discover as well. Like I'm constantly discovering new things about Dennis Hopper, and I avoid his life as much as possible because I know that there's problematic elements of his life, and I focus just on his work. But his work can also be problematic too.
Yeah.
So we're very aware of that.
Yeah, I could tell. That's, I mean, again, I brought it up from reading your book and thinking deeply about. I read the chapter before I watched the film, and so I could have things to focus on, and it gave me. I mean, I was, despite how simple the film is, my mind was racing. I mean, simple. I mean, in the structure of the film, it's quite simple, but the layers of cultural context and the music and the sound and everything, it just comes together to make it such a live piece of film media. So yeah, and your descriptions are really amazing. So highly recommend people check out your book.
Well,
um,
thanks.
I will
Well,
say,
check out the film as well. You know, I mean, it's
yes,
still.
absolutely.
I think it's still on a lot of curriculums. You know, Easy Rider. It's
Yeah,
still watched a great deal. You know, it's definitely of its time, but still has something to say about America today. I think,
yes,
especially in the context of things like "Make America Great Again," and you
sure.
know,
There's a line in the film where he says, "This used to be a great country," right? Like, or something
mm,
along those lines. He's
exactly,
talking,
yeah, and he's saying that in 1969.
right?
And really, I don't know what period he's talking about, but it's the same with when Donald Trump talks about
It's
a
the
past
same period
America.
that don't 100%. It's the
Yeah, I
same
don't know
period.
which period they're really. Yeah, I don't know. Well, yeah. So
Can only
it's
speculate.
very interesting. So unless George is talking about when there was slavery and when there was segregation, I mean that's the past from his perspective, and
Sure.
I'm sure Donald Trump is talking about the same thing as well.
Yeah, exactly.
It's yeah, it's considering the film is sometimes viewed as this very radical leftist film. It probably isn't. It's probably quite libertarian,
Yeah,
individualistic.
100%. Well, it's a
So,
rejection of. I mean, they leave the commune. They literally leave the commune. It's a
yeah.
rejection of
Yeah, it is.
collective
Yeah, yeah.
freedoms.
But again, this is stuff that has, this is stuff that's emerged to me over years. When I first watched it, I was like, you embrace it on that surface level, right? And you obviously the soundtrack is a huge concept with that thinking. But then you watch it again and again, and just more things emerge as you go through it.
Yeah,
It's cool.
a
Yeah.
deeply
Anyway,
layered film.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Strangely, it is. Yeah, strangely quite layered. Yeah.
So I think we can hop into some rapid fire questions. I was wondering which 60s counterculture anthem you think is missing from the soundtrack. If you could add a song somewhere to Easy Rider, what would you add?
Oh wow.
Yeah, take your time.
Yeah, no. It's we talked about the idea of female and uh, black voices missing from this soundtrack. So it'd be kind of cool to hear Jefferson Airplane or something like that. White Rabbit or Somebody to Love. Um, but what's interesting is when you think about these songs, it's by a band called the Young Bloods, and it's called Get Together, and
Get
it's a
together.
real hippie anthem. It's all about joining with each other and loving one another, and it's a great song, and it would have been exceptional to hear it on the soundtrack, but then it just doesn't work either. Like this is
No,
the
it
other
doesn't,
thing too, and
eh?
I'd love to hear the Door. Yeah, there's so many great bands from that period. There's the Rolling Stones, there's the Beatles, there's the Doors, and I love those. I love those bands, and I love the compositions that come from those bands. But to put them on Easy Rider would suddenly just feel really really weird. So, but saying that, so there's the book Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, which came out like a year or two after Easy Rider, and
Sure.
then was later adapted by Terry Gilliam in 1998, I think. Has the Young Bloods on it. Get Together. It has Jefferson Airplanes, White Rabbit. So I don't know. I feel sometimes the soundtrack to Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas is almost a sort of alternative soundtrack to Easy Rider in a way. You could switch them out and it might work. I don't know, but yeah, that's the only way. I can't hear any other song to sort of put anything else over the top of over the top of those visuals. They're just so entwined with each other
Yeah, sure.
that it just doesn't, I don't know, it just doesn't work any
Of
other
course.
way, which is, it's kind of like, well, yeah, I'd love to hear more black musicians or more female musicians on there. And then I'm like, but which ones and how would it work? It just,
Yeah,
it's
that's why we
almost,
need the 4-hour cut, right? So we can
well,
add all those
yeah,
songs.
exactly. Like if there was new footage,
Sure.
to kind of include, that could almost work. And but then, also as like films like Apocalypse Now, for example, has like the Rolling Stones on it and the Doors and stuff like that. It all kind of just combines. They're all from the same era and they all contain different music, but I don't know, it all kind of relates back to Easy Rider in some way.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, so I don't know. Sorry, that's not quick fire at all, is it?
No, lovely. No, lovely answer. No, that's about the length. That's perfect.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, what are your favorite I mean, we mentioned it briefly already, actually, with Human Traffic and Go. But do you have any more favorite films about British music?
Oh, about British music. Favorite films about British music. I don't know. Yeah. So Human Traffic. It's kind of feels to me. I think it actually came out in like post the millennium, but it feels like the last '90s movie to me, and it just kind of encapsulates a lot of the stuff that me like. I was not taking drugs in the 1990s, but me and my friends would definitely go out and party a lot. And it just kind of it gives me that sense of nostalgia, I guess. But
Sure.
not from me looking back at it now as like a guy in my 40s, but even as it came out, I kind of realized this part of my life that these characters experience, it is kind of over for me now. Like I'm in my 20s, these guys are in their 20s too, and the characters in that film also kind of come to a realization that this can't continue, and I think I was coming to the same realization
Sure.
at the same time. So yeah, the film Trainspotting, again, like a great film from great British film, but also a great soundtrack as well. So that's another one.
Well, Scottish film.
Yeah, well, it is Scottish. Yeah, the film. I'm not sure about the soundtrack, but there's a film by a filmmaker called Shane Meadows. He's a British filmmaker. Actually, grew up quite close to where I grew up too. He made a film in the mid 2000s called Dead Man's Shoes. It's not about British music, but it does have a really cool soundtrack.
Yeah, this
Bonnie
is
Prince
the
Billy.
same director as This Is England, right?
Yeah, yeah. And again, actually, this is England. Was a film and then became a TV show as well. That uses music very well as well. I just watched a film recently called Kneecap, which is
Oh
a
yeah,
film that's been winning lots
Irish,
of
right?
awards recently. Yeah, it's Irish film. It's about an Irish language like hip hop crew, and it just it's a great film about how music can kind of bring people together, but also how music can kind of bring community together as well. So I was really really impressed by that film. Definitely
Yeah,
one that I would go
I
back
love
to.
those boys. They are
Ah,
so cool.
they
The
are,
kneecap
yeah.
guys.
I hadn't really heard of them until the movie came along, actually, but yeah, they got really great skills, no question. And yeah, the film is a very uplifting film
Yeah,
about music and about community.
yeah, sweet, great shout. I was gonna say a quick shout out to 24-Hour Party People, which is easily my favorite film about British music. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's
Oh
truly
yeah,
incredible. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah. That was a big film for me as well, and the film Control as well, which was about
Oh
Joy
yeah,
Division.
Ian Curtis, right? Yeah.
Mm, yeah, yeah. Not obviously a very hopeful movie,
No,
but
that's sweet.
yeah, yeah. 24-hour party people's yeah. That's a great example. Um,
I was gonna say, what are your favorite like current bands? You have any new releases that you're listening to? Any sort of albums from the last couple years that you've enjoyed?
yeah, so I go to the gym quite a lot, and what I do is I try to do two things every week: listen to an old album and listen to a new album. So I've been listening to a band from, actually they're from this, I think they're from, oh man, are they from Oklahoma? They're from like a southern state. They're called Chat Pile.
Oh, I saw them live. I have an article about them.
Oh my God,
I
really?
saw them
Oh,
in
cool.
Toronto. Yeah. I've written an
Oh, that's
article
right.
about them.
They played
They're
Toronto pretty
the lead
recently.
singer. He has such a funny name. It's like Reagan Bush. Reagan Bush. This is a hilarious stage name. Reagan Bush has a letterbox profile, which is just smothered with unbelievable film references, super niche stuff. He also has a film podcast. And when I saw him live, he spent every single break in between songs talking about movies shot in Toronto. So he was like out of breath, shirtless, shoeless, like a wild animal, doesn't look at the stage or the audience at all. And he's like, okay, so what else was shot in Toronto? Oh yeah, this film. And then he would go on this tirade about all these movies, and then he would like stop talking and start the next song without any transition or whatever. It's totally wild.
Yeah, no, that's so cool. I'm just really like, so their record, God's Country, was definitely just one of the best records that I'd heard in the last few years. And I'm just really, as a middle-aged guy myself, I just love the fact that these guys are middle-aged dudes as well, just doing what they want to do. Like,
Sure.
I love that. I love that for them. Their music is so intense. It's great gym music. I will say that it's good stuff to work out to. Haven't had a opportunity to see them live. There's a band from New York called Bambira. They are kind of like Nick Cave-esque, kind of dark and brooding kind of music. They had an EP out a few years ago called Love on My Mind, which is a great EP. And they've got a new record coming out this year, so I'm going to be pretty excited about that.
Bambira,
they're called. Yeah. I'm really excited to hear what they're gonna do. I'm listening to a band called Tropical Fuckstorm. They're from New Zealand, I think. Maybe they're Australian. They're pretty psychedelic, pretty weird. Great lyrics. Yeah. So this is what I try to do. I try to listen to one album by a new band, and then try and listen to like an old record by a band by a band that I'm vaguely know. Like, I went to see the Dylan movie not too long ago, the Complete Unknown, and realized that I really only knew like about a 5-year period of Bob Dylan. I never listened to any of his later stuff at all, so I went back and listened to some later Bob Dylan, which was good. Yeah, it was cool. Yeah.
Awesome. So yeah, that's great. I think we can wrap it up here. I'd love to give you an opportunity to shout out your book and where it's available. And if there's anything else that you're working on, or you have any projects you'd like to shout out, that's a great opportunity now.
Yeah, thanks. So my book, Music and Sound in the Films of Dennis Hopper, came out with Routledge last year. It's coming out in paperback later this year, so if you want to save yourself like a ton of money, definitely go buy it when it's in paperback, or just go get your library to order it in, because we got to support our libraries. In terms of, I don't know, 2025 is turning out to be a busy year in terms of writing. So 2 of my books, one of which is called Screen Captures, was published by a Canadian press called New Star, who they operate out of Vancouver. They're unfortunately closing their business, and that book's going to go out of print. So I got potentially working with another publisher to do an updated second edition. So I think I'll be working on that, and then another one of my books is also going out of print, so I'm working with a publisher to try and do another edition of that as well. And then like a new book coming later this year or early next year. Just depends on peer reviews. I don't know. Yeah, I kind of entered the year thinking it would be quiet, and then suddenly it's becoming quite busy. It's definitely first world problems, though.
That's right. Well, I really appreciate you joining us today. This was wonderful, and I encourage everyone to go check out Easy Rider. It's a truly amazing film, and listen to the soundtrack. It's great. All right. Thank you so much, Steve.
Thank you so much, man. Really appreciate it.